For centuries, the story of settling Canada has been a story of the faithful, coping with incredible hardships and learning to help one another. But too often, this history has amounted to a variety of forms of exclusivism that says, my religion, not yours. My people are welcome, not yours. Then World War II happened. In its aftermath, a new form of religious conscience arrived in Canada. They were refugees from Europe who had opposed the Nazis and who had tried to save Jewish lives.
I was ordained a minister in 1958. It's important to note that I was myself an immigrant and the son of an immigrant family who had come through the Second World War experience of oppression under the Nazis and who had found a warm welcome and an opportunity far exceeding our expectations to make a new life for ourselves in Canada.
My parents worked with people who were fleeing from the Nazis. Many of them were of Jewish background, others were Christians who were opposing the Nazi regime. And those years made a deep impression on me that as a Christian, we ought to welcome and embrace and help people survive.
After the war, Canadians began to realize that they had indirectly participated in the Jewish Holocaust. Government policy turned back the Jewish boat people who had arrived on our shores, turned them back to certain death in concentration camps. People of conscience were horrified at what lay below the tip of the iceberg, a founding history of racism and exclusivism.
I think there is a culture that is in many respects hostile to newcomers or people who come from different parts of the world. Now, there's a long history of this in Canada.
Canada had the worst record in taking Jews between 1933 and 1948. Canada took only 5,000 Jews in all that period. A colleague of mine, Irva Bella, and Harold Troper wrote a book, None is Too Many, and that book documented the attitude of the Canadian government, which was, we don't want them.
That book and the story it tells of how we just dismally failed to respond to the desperate needs of Jewish refugees has, I think, left the mark. I think Canadians do feel some kind of responsibility to refugees as a result of that, and as a result of our treatment of Japanese Canadians in the war, but that's another story.
The War Measures Act in Canada was invoked. It's never been invoked in the U.S. What we did to the Japanese Canadians was far worse than anything that was done in the U.S. And what we did to the Doukhobors in the West was an extraordinary violation of human rights, even against the law, but we did it.
Sikhs were discriminated against. Chinese, we had a Chinese act that in fact, that was used as models by other racist governments, including Germany, to exclude groups you didn't want.
And we have some very dark chapters in our history where it's almost as if human rights were suspended or people's legal guarantees were just suspended. And so we have to look at that. And I do think it has to do with social stress. In times of social stress, Canadians tend to become incredibly intolerant.
After the war, I think the issue of refugees became a very live issue, and the conventions that define refugees, the Geneva Conventions, identified people whose lives would be at risk for political or religious reasons if they were to stay in their country. And in the very simplest form, that's the kind of definition of a convention refugee.
I remember there were a lot of Italian, there were a lot of East German, people who had been displaced after the Second World War. These were people who had survived the war, had been evicted from their homes. They were refugees, only we didn't know it at the time.
My parents, for example, had a family business, a retail clothing store, and it brought in all kinds of people. Hungarians worked for us, and Czech refugees, and Latvians, and Lebanese, and us. And it was quite a happy group and an interesting group. And I watched us interact. Those were my, formative experiences that made me question, what is it that makes this work in Canada, in a small town?
We began to change, and the big turning point was 1967. The idea of human rights with Diefenbaker, the idea of being open to the world, all these ideas began to percolate. Canada made its Immigration Act non-discriminatory. Instead of having preferences by certain groups and countries, it was a point system and a merit system for admission and immigration. And it was in that context that we began to shift. We had taken immigrants from Eastern Europe, refugees from Eastern Europe. We'd taken 37,000 Hungarian refugees, which was about 20% of the Hungarian refugee population. We then took from Czechoslovakia in 1968. But again, they were in our self-interest to take them. These were talented people, skilled people, matched the profile who Canadians wanted, etc. The big break in that came with the Asians who lived in Uganda. We took 7,000. It was the first time we took from a group who weren't Caucasians, but they were prosperous, they were business people, and we took the cream of the crop. But it broke that kind of racist kind of barrier.